Welcome to the CentralReach ABA On-Call podcast.
We do insist upon quick reinforcement.
Thought-provoking conversation, ideas, and trends in the applied behavior analysis industry.
With this type of arrangement of material, you can learn the same amount in about half the time with half the effort.
Now here are your hosts, Drs. Rick Cabina and Doug Kostowitz.
Welcome, everyone, back for another scintillating episode of ABA On Call. And today, Doug, we have an absolute treat. We have a guest who is going to be joining us. And our guest is none other than Kerri Milyko, who is the Director of Research and Development at the Learning Consultants. And for those of you who may not be aware of this, well, you probably are aware of this because we mentioned this before, but Doug and I had a podcast called the Precision Teaching Podcast, and Kerri was also one of our co-hosts. And Kerri, it's wonderful to have you for this episode.
It's so great to be back. It brings back awesome memories.
And Doug?
Getting the band back together, right?
Totally. The boys are back in town. Boys plus girl.
That's right. And it just so happens to, for our listeners, ABA On Call is a CentralReach podcast. And one thing that CentralReach is doing, which is new, is they have what's called a user conference. And the user conference is, imagine just what you think it is. A bunch of the users get together and go over new innovative concepts that are happening at CentralReach, talk about some of, not just the things that are happening in the future, but some of the things that are happening now. Everyone gets to network. It's a very cool party. And if those of you are CentralReach users, it would be wonderful if you joined. If you're not a CentralReach user and you just love listening to what we talk about, then that's great as well. The content that we have is going to be relevant to everybody here. And with that being said, I'd like to dive into our first topic, and that's talking about something that is called the element-compound relationship. Other people call this component-composite. Kerri, this is something that you spent a lot of time analyzing how people learn, putting things into this relationship of component composites or elements compounds. Could you take some time and explain to us what exactly is it?
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, I do. I spend a lot of my time designing curriculum with this in mind. When you take a lens of component composites, what this means, or element compound, what this means, you have a component or a more foundational skill. And let's take this, for example. This is a skill that is more basic in nature. And when you have these subunits, when put together, they then can build to a more hierarchical or greater skill that is then your compound or your composite skill. So, for example, if you can build some fine motor skills such as pincer grip or pinching, these then are foundations for, let's say, handwriting or a pencil grip or writing your name, right? If these component skills are not proficient, are not in the learner's repertoire, or even better yet, fluent, then the compound or composite skills are going, it's kind of building your house on sand. They fall apart, right? It's going to be rather impossible or extremely difficult for those composite skills or compounds to ever become proficient. So how in the world is a kid going to be able to become proficient in algebra if they are still counting on their fingers, right? So the importance of this you can see across in education, but more specifically in ABA. If you have a child who is having difficulty with manding, with tacting, or even we can take it to more foundational skills with imitation, then again, we're going to have a really hard time with them being able to do any more advanced skills.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this and reflecting on what you're saying, and I think that when you talk about what you just described, many people are immediately going to jump in and be like, oh, that sounds like task analysis. How's this not task analysis?
That's so funny because I just, we brought on a new soon-to-be consultant with our group, and I was reviewing this with her last week, and that she asked that same question. We totally did not stage this, right? She asked that same exact question. Task analysis is linear. Task analysis, you do steps in sequence. And component composites is not linear. It's anything but. It's tree-like. It's webbed. It branches out, and it's more, oh God, what word am I searching for here?
Linear was a good word, I think.
Well, I don't think that is all. I don't think that I think task analysis is linear. I don't think that necessarily element compound is always linear, though.
Oh, I gotcha. Definitely.
This actually sounds very similar. And of a research study that we conducted, and we looked at these element compound relationships where things like letter sounds. So we talked earlier in an earlier podcast about movement cycles, pinpoints, and pinpointing these very specific behaviors. Well, they played an element compound relationship with regards to spelling in the sense of see, say letter sounds, hear letter sounds, say the actual letter, etc. And what I think you're going for there, Kerri, is that notion that, hey, it's not just that see, say letter sounds has things to do with spelling. It also has things to do with reading. It's not a straight line between this element and this compound. It's that elements play roles across various compounds and interact fluidly, where if you are strong in certain core elements, it makes other composite skills or compound skills much easier to learn and perform, as they in turn play elements for later compound skills. Again, not in a straight one-to-one, straight down the line.
Right. Yeah. So where a task analysis is, you must do, if you do a task analysis for going to the bathroom, right, you must do these steps in sequential order. If not, then you're going to be peeing on your pants, right? Right. Whereas if you, exactly, Doug, in your example, you have different skills that can benefit others in more of a branch-like web, non-linear fashion, and I wish I had something better than those words, but whereas it has more of a generative effect where it branches out to assist in other types of skills, whereas with the incorporation of learning channels and more complexity of skills, then you develop when you see this play out in action, which is kind of hard when you're talking about a podcast. But if we were to, whip up a slide and show you, it can create more of like a tree or a web as opposed to a straight line. When you create more of a general element compound, it can look to be like a line because it can be a spectrum. But when you get to a fine-grained element compound analysis, it is anything but a line pictorially. So So yeah, thanks for the assist there, Doug. I appreciate it.
What I think, which is valuable for our listeners, is, and this is something that came from one of our earlier colleagues named Eric Houghton, who was one of the people who really pushed this concept forward and helped a lot of people think about it. And Kent Johnson, too, talks about this in his book. But there is a very nice analogy with chemistry. And in chemistry, it's nice to think of elements in compounds, which is, by the way, why I like the terms elements and compounds. But components and composites is the same concept. It's just different language. In chemistry, if you have sodium and you have chloride, that's going to come together and give you this compound, which is sodium chloride, salt. And behaviorally, it's the same idea that you have this behavior that will, well, the analogy is the same. These repertoires that can come together and provide you with this more complex behavior. Because at the end of the day, when it gets down to it, our task of dealing with behavior is incredibly complex. And there's so much that people have to understand. And oftentimes, this is what Kent likes to say, which I stole from him. No, steal is an ugly word. I borrowed it from him. The problem to be solved, wait, how does he say it? The problem to be solved is not always the problem that presents itself.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, I would like us to move on to something else that's related to this, which is talking about content analysis. Kerri, you have, as I mentioned earlier, spent a lot of time working not just with this notion of breaking things down, but specifically looking at the content that needs to be broken down. Talk to us about content analysis. What does that mean? What does it entail?
Sure. So this is one of the first steps that you want to take when you are creating one of the first steps in instructional design. And unfortunately, instructional design really isn't taught in graduate programs or in our training in behavior analysis, and it's kind of passed down kind of like your grandma's apple pie recipe, right? You kind of learn it while you're cooking in the kitchen with your mama who learned it from her mama, right? And that's kind of how you learn things with programming from your supervisor. Funders don't really appreciate it and don't pay for it. But what you want to do is, and this part's really skipped over, and so that's why I really want to spend time on it, is that content analysis is when you sit and you really think about this one skill that you're trying to teach, about all these different components, now that we know what that is. And it's components of this one skill, masterful skill. So not necessarily all the historical elements that led up to this skill, but the nuances of this skill that led up to it. What do masterful people of this one skill do? So let's break this down. I recently had a motor skill where I took a foam, those noodles that you sit in the pool on, right? You float on them, right? Sure. And we're working on motor skills. We're doing some balance work and so I have my learners jump over them. So I'm swinging it across the floor, if you can imagine it, and my learners are to hop over it. Now, what's presented in this is they can hop over it in different ways. They can go side to side. They can leap over it. They can jump forward and backwards, right? So in that way, and when I sit and I look at a content analysis, I can look at different ways in which they hop, right? So that's one critical feature. So in my content analysis, I can look at various critical features. I can look at, so learning channels is a critical feature in my content analysis. I can look at the height in which they jump, right? So masterful hoppers of this skill, analysis of that is going to be a variable feature of this analysis. I can look at the speed in which I move my noodle, right? That's going to be a critical feature of this skill. I can look at, let's say, if the thing is even moving or not, right? I can even just place the noodle on the ground and even have them hop over that. So we can look at all of the different things that we're asking learners to do, and we break them into parts and look at various complexities. Even having a learner do their own daily schedule. Are they doing a daily schedule of a specific routine? Is it a daily schedule of a part of the day? Is it a daily schedule of the full day, right? So a content analysis is breaking apart critical attributes of a specific task, but you have to sit and do a complete analysis of that. So there's some great articles from Janet Twyman, T.V. Jolane, Tina Markle that really guide you into designing content analyses. There's they tell you how, like, they did this with HeadSprout. When you do content analysis of complete curricula, they will you do research of your population, of the content itself. But you can also do that within a very specific program, such as I just described.
I, as you're talking and I'm thinking about this, it all makes so much sense. And then I think back about a lot of behavior analytic programs. We have to squeeze a lot of information for people who become BCBAs. And, they got to learn the basics of our science, just, reinforcement, punishment, all these other complicated things, stimulus equivalence, and so on. And I don't know many programs that talk at all about content analysis and how to prepare people to leverage that so that when they are behavior analysts, they're able to use it and program for that.
No, there's not a lot. I know University of West Florida is integrating it into theirs. That's just the only one that I know of offhand that specifically is addressing that need. Just because I'm creating the course for it, so that's the only way that I intimately know of that. But yeah, they and the unfortunate thing is that we see that across the board. People are teaching to the assessment, and that's not really the point. The point is that we want to create curriculum that fits for the learner, and the assessment is to assess these general benchmark skills, right? Just like in education, we don't want to just teach to the test, but we want to, if we don't conduct these content analyses and then create programs that fill in these gaps, then we have these learners that, I actually have one. I had an older learner that I was working on same different program, and then I realized he could tact. Oh, this is a cow, this is a horse. But then when I said, is this a horse, yes or no? He could easily tact the horse. But then when I said, is this a horse, yes or no? He 50-50 chance could answer the yes or no question. And so you then end up with older learners with splinter skills. Their repertoire looks like Swiss cheese, right? And so when you don't know how to program in this way with creating programs that allow you, or where you were able to spend a lot of time designing it thoughtfully with this content analysis, then you have learners with gaps that are they learned kind of in a kind of robotic way.
I've had a chance to speak to some of our listeners in conferences, and I've also interacted with some people offline. And one thing, and this isn't just our audience, I'm sure this is everyone that listens to Behavior Analytics podcasts, but what's great about our field is that people listen so they can gain knowledge. And although this is a topic that people need to know more about, it's great the way you broke it down and explained its relevance. What I'll do for people is in the show notes, we'll reference a couple of those articles and references that you shared, so that because there's only so much you can talk about in a short 10-minute span, and that's certainly not enough to get people to understand it. But raising awareness is incredibly important, and you described the importance of content analysis and why it's so important. So that was right on the mark there.
Thanks.
For our final topic today, we're going to switch gears and talk about ethics and graphical displays. Normally, when we talk about ethics, it revolves around inappropriate relationships between therapists or supervisors and clients, or perhaps conflicts of interest while we're working. But what we want to talk about here is a certain code, 1.01 in the BACB code, that talks about reliance on scientific knowledge. And I'm going to read that, and then we're going to talk about it in relationship to graphical displays. 1.01 says, behavior analysts rely on professionally derived knowledge based on science and behavior analysis when making scientific or professional judgments in human service provision, or when engaging in scholarly or professional endeavors. Rick, quickly, when you hear that and you hear graphical displays, what comes to mind?
We are all three of us who are on this call right now happen to subscribe to using the standard acceleration chart. But beyond the fact that we've used it for a while is this greater conversation, as you perfectly tied the BACB code to this. We are all duty bound to continually look for the best tools. I mean, we're ethically bound to look for the best tools to help us understand nature. And the nature that we happen to be dealing with is behavior. So when I think about what you just read and what you just talked about, yes, it's very important to talk about ethics surrounding exploitative relationships and so on when you're working with people, but it's equally important to start looking at the ethics between or around the actual tools that we're using. And I can't think of anything that is more relevant than the graphs that we use, because it's something that everybody is going to come in contact with probably every single day that they're doing their work.
We spoke last time, or one of our previous podcasts, about leaving data on the table and what information is provided through a non-standard linear chart and the standard acceleration chart and the differences there. And the idea that I see when I hear what I read and I think about this is, what decisions are being made given both of those graphs, given both of those displays? Are they the same decisions? Are we guiding individuals in the right way? Are we responding to that data in the same way? And that raises concerns, and that raises the question that, are they the same decision? And it gets back to, is it being tied to the best information available?
Yeah. You and I have talked about this, not just from the research angle, but I'd like to bring Kerri in. Kerri, you've run learning centers, and you have staff. Some of those staff have never seen a chart. Where's the value that you, at least in terms of ethics, of making decisions, and you have parents who are paying you and for your client services, or for the services. Where does the chart come in working on the practical side?
There's we only use the chart across all of our learning centers. Ethically, it allows us, it brings in fidelity, so that way with one standard modality, there's a time where we used multiple graphic displays, and there was a lot of confusion. There was a need for just tons of training, and at that time there was some low fidelity across how to interpret, how to intervene based on the data. And so it became paramount for us to switch over to single displays. And even with the chart, we can still look at, the chart has a count per day chart for some of those instances where that's appropriate.
So I was going to say, so the standardization came into play that everyone is on the same page for the individual, between individuals, between therapists, between parents, that you only have to talk about this one time. There's never an ability for one therapist to perhaps create a chart that is improperly constructed. Now, so that everybody, it's no longer the data display is never in question. A line is a line, a dot is a dot. We all know what it means. Well, fabulous.
And then we set our goals. So we set our goals for our learners based on the chart. So we set our daily goals for our learners. We set, we have our trajectory. We're like, okay, so let's push them. Like we have, we want their accelerations, so for our listeners who are not users of the standard acceleration chart, so that's their projected learning line of growth. So we want their progress to be better. And so we have our instructors, our RBTs, set their daily goals to be better based on the data on the chart, so it's based on the data display. So they're intimately involved with the data display tool. It isn't, on the computer somewhere that's not being interacted with our RBTs, our frontline staff. It's constantly involved, it's constantly integrated in the learner's activity, in our RBT's activity during the session. The data is being incorporated, like our learners see the data. They know if they hit a daily goal. We have peaches and lemons, which is like their best performance ever. So if they hit their best performance, then they get even better reinforcers, or instant break, and they can go play in the playroom, stuff like that. So all of the reinforcement is linked up to that data display tool as well. Or it's not a data display tool, it's an analytic tool.
Right. Actually, you raised a good point as a practical example, and I think that this has also bearing in the research as we make decisions on what we publish, what data gets published, and we tend to rely on time series data. And what I'm sure that you can do that you would not be able to do with an equal interval or a non-standard equal interval chart is that interventions, you may use some similarities across kids, and you start to see certain acceleration gains. You start to see certain level change. You start to see bounce change. Basically, all the metrics associated with the standard acceleration chart, you can begin to look for themes across the intervention, across types of kids, across different behaviors, which in the literature, we talk about literature reviews or meta-analyses, but we're left with talking about, let's get this statistic or let's get this other thing. Whereas if you have similar displays, meaning you use a standard display, you can begin to say, what were the accelerations shown for this behavior across all these kids? What was this intervention producing? What was this intervention producing? And you can see that in the research. And I'm sure that you get to see that working with your clients, and individuals can start to see, hey, we've never seen gains using this intervention, and we can actually put a number on that.
Exactly, Doug. And, it's practical, but then tying it back to the ethical piece. So because we see patterns of this program or this learning channel paired up with this particular intervention, we've created an intervention list, essentially, where we give our RBTs the freedom to utilize interventions without having to go to their supervisor and say, these are interventions that you can use when you see with this program and this pattern, data pattern, stuff like that. Because ethically, we don't want there to be a worsening picture or a flat line for X amount of days, with the supervisor not having eyes on it. But the RBTs, they see that daily. You don't want to have so much time go by, because the supervisors, maybe they see the case on a weekly schedule, or maybe they see him every, 4 days or something like that. But here's the RBT, and they see, hey man, they know if it's not going well. Yeah, intervene. You know what needs to be done. Don't wait. Because we have the clinical data or the empirical data to support that we know these interventions work well. Go ahead and implement them, because a worsening picture for that long is unethical. And if we have the truckloads of data to support that these interventions will be appropriate for that learning channel, that pinpoint for that learner, then go ahead and implement. So
this is something that we could talk about for another hour. I love the points that you both made. Whenever I talk about ethics and graphical display, especially when we start talking about the chart, there's one thing I always like to bring up, and that is, we're not saying if you don't use the chart, you're unethical. And I was in a conversation once, and someone actually thought that was a comment that I was making, and that's not the conversation at all. The conversation is ethics and our reliance on scientific knowledge. There is a relationship between the tools that we're using to understand how we analyze and make decisions and how we handle our data. And that relationship is established, it's very clear, and it's something that we need to pay more attention to. And I believe, it's my firm belief, that as more and more evidence comes out that shows that the chart is a more efficient, better device for us to figure out what's going on with the client, to help people become more efficient, to, in essence, create superior outcomes, then our field's going to act accordingly to that information. Doug and Kerri, we've said it all. Kerri, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thanks for having me.
And Doug, buddy, it's always great talking with you.
Same here.
If you are a CR Institute or a CR user and you're interested in the topics that we discussed today, would love to have you at the user conference. That is going to be in our show notes with how you sign up. If you're not a CR user and you still love these topics, please feel free to drop us a line at any time, and we could give you more information. And of course, we will talk about these issues more in the future. I'd also like to stop and thank you, listener. I would give you a hug or a high five, whatever is appropriate, because we now have crossed the threshold. We've had over 2,000 downloads. So yay, thank you. This happens because you all out there find this information valuable. So please continue to share this with your friends and colleagues, and thank you. Well, thank you, Kerri and Doug, again for helping us spread the word and talk about these important concepts and topics. I look forward to seeing you all again on the next episode of ABA On Call.
Thank you for listening to the CentralReach ABA On Call podcast with Drs. Rick Cabina and Doug Hostowitz.
This is verbal behavior, and
You can find the show notes for this episode on centralreach.com/ABA On Call. Please stay connected with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by following @CentralReach and subscribe on the podcast player of your choice.